In a previous video, I went through the basic structure of an inference to the best explanation. And so in this video, I'm going to take that structure and apply it to an actual problem. Now the problem here will be a real simple one, ridiculously easy in fact, but I think it'll be useful not just to see the basic components of an IBE, but to actually see it in action. And again, this is exactly what will be required on the quiz. You're going to be given a problem, and the answer will be immediately obvious. But for this quiz question, even though the answer will be obvious, as is kind of the case here actually, what I'm looking for is that you can think through the problem, even though you already know the answer, using the basic criteria of an inference to the best explanation. Let me point out one last time here that the basic structure of an IBE is covered in a separate video. It's also covered in the 13.4 lecture notes. If you learn best by reading as opposed to watching a video lecture, read the lecture notes. Even if you learn best by a video, I would highly recommend reading the lecture notes. In those lecture notes, I also go through a different problem and walk you through it step by step. So it won't take much time to do this. You're going to want to go through more detail in your analysis and your essay response for the quiz, that is. But this will at least give you an idea as to how to think your way through the problem. So let's start with that which is to be explained. We've got two E's here, two bits of evidence, two things we know to be true. Number one, we wake up in the morning to discover that the driveway is wet, that the streets are wet as well. And yet the night before, we were watching the news, and the weather report indicated that the skies would be clear. No real chance of rain, so says the weather report. And then again, E1, we wake up nonetheless to discover that everything's wet. So how can we explain both E1 and E2? And of course, there would be many other ways to explain this, but two hypotheses immediately come to mind. H1, it rained. H2, the neighbor actually washed his car, and so the driveway's wet and the streets are wet as well. So what we want to know is which of these two is the best explanation. We're going to make an inference to the best explanation. As I discussed in the earlier video, an IBE, an inference to the best explanation, is inductive, but there are several criteria that need to be considered here. So number one, adequacy, in other words, explanatory power. Is there an advantage for either H1 or H2? And what I've done here is create a little score sheet. Now for your essay, I'm not looking for a score sheet. You might want to start with a score sheet, but for your essay, it is to, as the name indicates, be an essay format. So as I'm doing here, you might start with a score sheet, but really you'll need to be able to explain this verbally, and again, you'll be expected to apply each of the four. So number one, adequacy, in other words, explanatory power. Can H1 explain both E1 and E2? H1, it rained. Would this explain E1? We wake up to discover a wet driveway and streets. Well, H1 would certainly explain E1, wouldn't it? If it rained, we'd expect everything to be wet. Can H1 explain E2? The weather report indicated clear skies overnight, no rain expected overnight. How can H1 explain E2? If it can't, then maybe we should abandon H1 and go with H2. Well, for H1 to explain E2, that is, for H1 to explain E2, we would have to conclude that the weather report was actually wrong. And is that plausible? Well, a weather report is a prediction. Prediction is inductive, and we know, of course, that weather reports aren't always accurate. So H1 would certainly explain E1, and H1 would explain E2 by declaring that the weather report was wrong. So it can explain both. We're not saying that that would be the best explanation, but I'll just put a check mark there. H1 would explain E1 and E2. Could H2 explain E1 and E2? That the neighbor washed his car overnight. H2 could certainly explain E2. Didn't rain, just as the weather report explained, or the weather report predicted, that is. How can H2, and this would be the challenge, how can H2 explain E1? Well, H2 would explain E1, neighbor washed his car, water went everywhere, and that certainly explains this part, doesn't it? Neighbor washed the car, driveway's wet. It's a little bit more problematic here to explain the streets being wet, not just the street in front of our house. Maybe the neighbor washed the car in the driveway, so the driveway's wet, and then water ran down the street, and we would expect it to be wet maybe in front of our house. But the streets, plural, are wet. Well, the explanatory power is kind of lacking there. Now let me tie in some information from chapter 14. We can make an ad hoc modification to H2, couldn't we? The neighbor washing the car, H2, can explain the driveway. But what about all the streets? We can make an ad hoc modification and say, not only did, for H2, the neighbor wash his car, but maybe everybody in the neighborhood washed their car. And so we can make it work. We can modify H2, an ad hoc modification, conveniently modifying the hypothesis to make it fit. We'll conveniently modify it. It wasn't just our neighbor, it was everybody in the neighborhood, all the neighbors. So it's kind of problematic here. An ad hoc modification would make it work, but an ad hoc modification in and of itself, of course, is problematic. So even though we really are leaning towards this, H1, let's continue to work our way through the remaining three criteria. What about internal coherence? Does H1 contradict itself? Does H2 contradict itself? And there isn't really any contradiction, is there? The only possible contradiction is that H1 is inconsistent with E2, but we can explain that just simply by declaring the weather report to be wrong. Would that be an ad hoc modification? We're going to conveniently modify it to declare E2 was wrong. Well, it's not as blatant of an ad hoc modification as compared to saying, well, everybody washed their car overnight. The whole neighborhood had a big block party while we were asleep, didn't invite us, and they washed their car. So I think this sounds more plausible, doesn't it? But there isn't a flat-out contradiction in either theory. They both tell a coherent story, if you will. So I'll go ahead and put a check mark for each of them. We'll give a little credit, I suppose, to E2. What about external consistency? Does it contradict with other things that we generally know to be true? Does H1 contradict other things that we know to be true? Well, there's a slight problem here with, again, E2. We have to declare that the weather report is wrong. There's a slight problem, I suppose, with H1, that it rained. I mean, we live in eastern Washington. How often does it actually rain? Usually we have clear sunny days. But of course we know that it does rain. This is certainly plausible. It doesn't contradict. It just looks a little funny. The weather report said clear skies, doesn't rain all that often. This initially seems unlikely. But compared, of course, to H2, does this contradict with other things we know to be true? Well, is it consistent with your experience that people generally wash their cars overnight? That doesn't really fit with your background information, does it? With your general experience? With this ad hoc modification, we have not just our neighbor washing his car, but we've got everybody in the neighborhood washing their cars to account for the streets being wet. Is that consistent with your experience, with your general background information, how things usually work? People get together, an entire neighborhood of people get together and wash their cars overnight to explain the evidence here. It didn't rain, everything's wet because there was a block party where everybody washed their cars. And oh, by the way, nobody told us. We had a block party, everybody's doing this, but we weren't invited. Well, this one, again, H1 is making a little bit more sense. This one doesn't really make all that much sense. Now, Occam's razor. Which one is more straightforward? Which one is the more simplistic theory? Well, it rained. That's consistent with our background information. We know that it doesn't rain much, but we would expect when it does rain to discover that the driveway is wet, the street's wet, that everything is wet. So that's a pretty simple statement to make, right? There's not a lot of baggage. There's not a lot of strings attached to it. That it rained, pretty straightforward. Now, what about our theory that our neighbor washed the car, and now it expanded, right? Notice it's getting a lot more complicated to explain everything. Not only did our neighbor wash their car, But everybody, overnight, nobody told us. It's one big conspiracy here. Everybody washed their car, and that gives this full explanatory power. Well, H1 is real straightforward. H2 is, again, kind of turning into one big conspiracy theory here with these ad hoc modifications to give us adequacy here. It's a less than elegant hypothesis at this point. It's logically possible. What about not only the driveway being wet, but the streets being wet? The grass, maybe, if we include that in E1, are also being wet. How does washing the car, H2, account for that? H2, the more we think about it, the more we consider it, doesn't really make a lot of sense. It's logically possible, I suppose. There's no flat-out contradiction in supposing that it might be the case. But if we consider closely each of the 4 criteria here, H1 clearly seems like the best explanation, right? And we'll account for this. The weather report was wrong. That's inductive anyway. We know that sometimes it fits with our background information, right? In your experience, has the weather report ever been wrong? Of course. In your experience, have there been times at least where the weather report said it's not going to rain, and yet it rains, even here in eastern Washington? H1, when we consider it, is clearly the best explanation. And again, you'll be asked to do something similar for the quiz. I'm not looking for a score sheet. You'll need to actually write it out. It's an essay after all, but this is how you think your way through using the tools of an inference to the best explanation.